Okay, so welcome to this BCCIC online presentation webinar. We are talking with some of the youth delegates that went to COP23 with BCCIC in 2017 and hearing a little bit about some of the work they've been doing, their impressions of COP, and what they think we should be doing in the future for climate change and BCCIC at COPs. So thank you very much for being here, and it'll be great to hear your thoughts. And we will get started. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Deb.
Hi. So I just wanted to take a moment before letting the actual delegates take over the conversation, just to give a little bit of a framing of kind of why BCCIC decided to put together a youth delegation and what kind of the process and the strategy was behind that. And, you know, it all stems from these regional roundtable tours that we did over the course of a year and a half in 2015, 2016, where we went across the province and had conversations initially about the Sustainable Development Goals and the importance of them and how they might land in the work that people were doing around the province. But out of those conversations, a lot of points kept coming up over and over again about mainly the importance of political engagement around the issues, and about the importance about volunteerism and youth engagement in a lot of these issues and getting young people involved. And as many of you I think know from seeing a lot of our webinars, the SDGs are all encompassing, and just one of the aspects of the SDGs is climate action. And I would say it's one of the primary cross-cutting themes of the framework, and it hits on every goal and every target. And it's something that we in this office, Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation, have a background in and an interest in. So we saw the opportunity of COP, of the Conference of Parties for the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Conference Series, as a way to engage youth, to listen to what we heard and support youth who have a presence and I think the tools who are going to solve a lot of these issues, or at least delay the worst. With the delegation itself, this goes back to last year at the High Level Political Forum delegation to the SDGs. And for that meeting, we were actually able to get two youth on the official delegation to HLPF. And it's something that we are pushing for future COPs, and in fact for all future meetings that Canada is involved in at the international level, to have both civil society and youth representation on the official delegations. So that's something we're still pushing for, but in the meantime we're doing it through this modality that we think has been relatively successful, and we're going to hear back a bit from the delegates today to see how to build it. But the idea was to have, and this is very, very important, a very rigorous, transparent, and timely system for nominating and selecting youth for the delegation. And that means that the selection, in our opinion, should be peer-led, meaning that it should be youth selecting youth, and not us and the BCCIC staff or the office who are doing that. And so that's the way it was led, and a lot of it fell under the leadership of Jeffrey, who you're going to hear from on the webinar. And as his colleagues have pointed out, he was kind of a mentor in this, having been through the process of past COPs, and was able to really lead putting together the delegation, but also the next steps of once we had the delegation selected, we had to take the time to strategize and how we were going to engage when we got there. So we held a couple strategy sessions, and it really helped us kind of figure out how individual goals and interests align with the different streams of negotiations that were going on at COP. And because of this, when we actually got to Bonn, to Germany, I was the head of delegation, and then these guys who you'll hear from joined me. Because of that strategizing and that connection, I think, to personal goals, we were able to follow every stream of negotiation at COP. And we were able to keep each other up to date on what was going on, keep the public up to date, what was going on through some mechanisms that these guys will talk about a little bit more, and able to keep me up to date. It was the first time I've been to one of these meetings where I didn't have to try to follow everything on my own, and for that I owe a huge debt of gratitude to this team, and I'm forever thankful for you guys. And I think we did a really great job making connections there and making impact. And with that, I will turn it over to you guys, because you were the ones who did so much of the work. So thank you again, and yeah, let's hear from you.
Great, thank you, Deborah. So at first, let's just introduce ourselves.
Cool, yeah. So my name is Kayla Scott, and I'm a student studying marine biology and minor in political science. And I was interested in applying to join the delegation to COP last year because even though I have a science background, I think it's very important for scientists to engage on in political discourse at various levels of government. And so I saw going to COP and learning from the staff at BCCIC and my fellow youth delegates about the process of how policy is written with regards to climate change.
I'm Colton Castile, also a student at UBC studying international economics. I was really interested in following the climate finance file of negotiations. And on a similar theme to Kayla, working in economics to dialogue was really important to me. I felt that that background wasn't engaged enough in the environmental scene. So that was something that I wanted to represent in the COP.
My name is Jeffrey. I'm a second-year political science student at UBC with a minor in louder? Okay.
Sorry.
So if you can hear us at any point, just shoot us a text message and
keep bothering us.
Keep bothering us. So my name is Jeffrey. I study political science at UBC with a minor in environmental sustainability. I was the coordinator for this project. I went to the previous SB46 session in May in Bonn with the International Forestry Student Association, and I continue work volunteered for BCCIC to bring this youth delegation together. At COP23, I mainly focus on capacity building and action for climate empowerment because I feel the raising awareness and education of climate change is instrumental in each country and different actors of society to bring together and act collectively to solve this issue.
Hi, I'm Verna. I'm in 4th year or 5th year at UBC studying international relations with a minor in Asian area studies. I followed the Indigenous Peoples platform at COP23. That stems from my interest working in Indigenous affairs teams at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and so I want to see what Canada is doing on the international level. I also engage with people from East Asia. That's a region of interest, and I hope to forward East Asia and a collaboration future for climate change.
Right, so just to go over the overview of this webinar, at first we are going to talk a bit about what we did at COP23, what's our delegation's mission or impact at the conference, and then we are going to delve into youth engagements at international processes like COP23, as well as the obstacles to youth, as well as civil society organizations at these kind of conferences. And we will leave some time for question and answers at the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions, we will wait till the end and we'll answer all your questions. So the idea of the COP23 Youth Delegation Program is to connect enthusiastic BC young people with international negotiations and the international climate change movement. We want to build capacity and empower the young people of British Columbia to seek solutions and join in the conversation of combating climate change and environmental degradation. So each one of us have a specific focus at COP23. As mentioned, marine and ocean, climate finance, capacity building, indigenous platform, and for other delegates, domestic policy, international cooperation. So we've made a lasting impact. This project made a lasting impact on all of the youth delegates involved in this project, as well as the community. So back in last year in June, the BCCIC started this process of selecting youth delegates to COP23. It took roughly 2 months for a committee of BC youth to put together a plan and a selection criteria to select youth delegates to COP23. And beginning of August, we accepted application and reviewed them and conducted interview with all of the applicants. and selected 7 people to be the COP23 Youth Delegation. So the 4 of us study at UBC, and the rest 3 unfortunately have some schedule conflicts. 2 of them are overseas and 1 is in class. So yeah, and after the selection, we had 2 months time to prepare for the conference, strategizing what's our core mission, how are we going to engage different actors in Bonn, and that includes sending out emails to a whole bunch of people, trying to get meetings on the ground in Bonn, and discuss our perspectives on climate change and UNFCCC processes. So after COP, we conducted several capacity building events around campus and in our communities, in our classes. So this is where we go around and talk to people about what COP is, what we did in COP23, and what's the major achievement COP23 has achieved in Bonn. We've engaged around 150 more community members during these capacity building talks and stuff. So we're creating a momentum for the next generation of young leaders to take charge in climate change and join the discourse and try to seek solutions to these urgent issues. So I'm just going to turn to Colton, and he will talk a bit about what we did, the delegation did in Bonn at COP23.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly go over our activities. Prior to COP, Kayla and I actually arrived in Bonn early to attend the Conference of Youth. And that was a really great experience and helps a lot for preparations and specifically for networking purposes. We were quite actively involved in participating with the youth constituency of the UNFCCC, so otherwise known as YOUNGO, or the International Youth Climate Movement. We attended a number of different sessions and really got to know some of our peers from other countries, and that really allowed us going forward into COP to make those connections and attend specific events and kind of know all the ins and outs of the processes. In week 1, we were the first people in delegation actually all together, and week 1 a lot of that was attending different separate workshops. So as we previously mentioned, everyone had a different focus, and I think that really brought a holistic vision to our group. We had Brenna following the Indigenous Affairs platforms, and myself on climate finance, Kayla on oceans, Jeffrey on action for climate empowerment, and that all kind of brought together every single day a really solid vision of what was happening at COP. So we attended kind of some of the informal negotiations as well, taking notes on those, attending different working groups. So I myself was part of the finance working group for YOUNGO, and Kayla was part of the working group for oceans for YOUNGO. And Kayla actually spoke at the intervention, right?
Oh yeah.
I was
I
trying
did
to remember.
do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll elaborate on
Cool.
that.
Yeah. So we were all quite actively involved as best as we could be. A lot of our day-to-day stuff included attending some of the YOUNGO meetings in the morning and the Canadian delegation meetings in the morning. And then moving forward into week 2, our second week delegation had some meetings with high-level government officials and others. So some of those included Elizabeth May, leader of the Federal Green Party of Canada, BC Minister of Environment and Climate Change, George Heyman, Ken Alex, who's the Senior Policy Advisor to Jerry Brown, Governor of California, and also Canadian Deputy Ambassador to Germany, Jennifer May. Yes. So we had a number of meetings with those people, and outcomes came out of that, specifically for some of the issues that we wanted to bring to light for what youth prioritized, and especially for the Minister, George Heyman, and for Elizabeth May, who had a lot of pull in the Canadian political scene. Yeah, so overall, that was kind of an overview of our activities, and we can get more in depth to that.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So now that we've been provided with a bit of a list of what this delegation specifically did at COP, I'll talk a little bit more generally about the way in which youth internationally are able to participate in the UN climate negotiations and actually help to write the policy and influence the outcome of the negotiations. So the structure of the UN climate framework is such that it's a party-driven process, so the governments have most power, but civil society is represented by 9 constituencies, is what they're called. And these 9 constituencies represent different interest groups within civil society. So there's women and business interests, environmental NGOs, and then of course the youth constituency, which all of us were quite active in. It's called YOUNGO, and it stands for Youth NGOs. And even though the purpose of the youth constituency and all constituencies is to be a unified voice for that particular civil society interest that's recognized by the UN Climate Secretariat, within the constituency there is a lot of diversity of interests, and so within YOUNGO, the work that is done is sort of divided into various working groups that reflect aspects of the climate negotiations, like adaptation and mitigation and finance. Is there an Indigenous one? Yeah, there's an Indigenous one. And then there are also just administrative, bottom lining, communications and media and things like that. And so in that way, we were able to really engage with other youth on topic areas that we were passionate about and had a background in, so that we could really specialize, because the climate conference is so big and the negotiations are so complicated that it's just impossible to know everything that's going on. And so honing in was one thing that we really did. And the nice thing about the constituencies is that because they're officially recognized by the Secretariat, they have some say in the negotiation processes. They're able to deliver formal interventions to the countries in the form of speeches in the various plenary sessions and committees, and they also are able to submit policy recommendation documents reflecting the constituency's interests. And so within our working groups, we actually helped draft YOUNGO's position paper on all of the topics that were being negotiated at the COP. So I wrote the section for oceans and what you thought the countries should do to use oceans as a way of reducing the impacts of climate change. And Colton, as part of the finance working group, worked on the finance, or what youth around the world think how climate finance should work and things like that. And so that was both a great learning opportunity for us, because we really felt we had to do a lot of research and also talk to other peers to make sure that we were accurately reflecting the view of youth. Yeah, I think I'll say one more thing about the youth constituency is that last year they launched a program called Global South Scholarships, where it's funded by the Secretariat.
Funded by the German government.
Right. Okay. So funded by the German government, but facilitated by some members of YOUNGO, so youth themselves. They basically were able to get money to send youth from Global South countries to the COP, and just to increase participation and make sure that youth who might not necessarily otherwise have the financial means to be at those negotiations still have their voice heard and know what's going on, and are able to go back to their home countries and do much like we did here at UBC, tell the other youth what's actually going on behind closed doors at COP, and tell them how they can also get involved for the climate action. Yeah.
So we mentioned that you participated in a plenary session for delivering intervention.
Yeah.
On behalf of YOUNGO, would you like to elaborate on that?
Okay. Yeah. So so YOUNGO, as I said earlier, they're able to deliver interventions on specific topic items. The Secretariat will actually invite them to deliver like a 2-minute speech. And so I volunteered and went into the plenary hall and sat down behind the placard that said civil society, and I was super nervous because I was going to be delivering this speech, and all the countries were going to hear it, and the president of the COP was going to hear it. And the way that the debate works is you have to wait until you're called upon. You can't just like raise your hand and say whatever you want. So I was waiting for them to call upon the representative for youth NGOs, and they never called me. So I actually didn't make the speech. I sat there, and Jeffrey took a picture of me sitting behind the placard too, which was really exciting. But yeah, I was a little bit disappointed, and that kind of just goes to show that sometimes civil society is an afterthought in a lot of these talks, which is a criticism of the UN process, and something that I think we need to work on more.
So Bernard's gonna talk a bit about what's kind of the obstacles of youth engagements at COP23 or at other international processes like this. Although Kayla has mentioned, although civil society is an integral part in these international negotiations, but there are still limitations as to what we can do on the ground in Bonn or any other negotiations. So
yeah. Before I actually start, I want to add that Youngo actually did a press conference for both weeks, and so did our delegation as well with other Canadian youth who attended COP. And so Jeffrey and Kayla helped coordinate our week 1 press conference, and we had other youth organizations from across Canada, including the official Canadian Youth Delegation, Online Jeunesse, Youth Policy Climate Lab, I believe that's called. So it was a really good showing of Canadian youth in solidarity and showcasing what we've been working on, and as well as our recommendations for the government as well. So now I'll jump into what are some of the challenges that youth and CSO or civil society more broadly faces at COP and at the UN FCCC process. And these are largely based on what we've said in our project impact report, which is available on the BCCIC website. And the first 2 challenges kind of pertain more towards youth, but I believe that civil society might experience similar ones, and a third definitely shared by both youth and civil society more generally. So the first challenge that we definitely encountered was just the burden of time and money that it takes to participate at COP23. So we really appreciate this opportunity, first of all, but we had to seek funding by ourselves. And for some delegates, that meant working in the summer while trying to do courses. For others, it also meant applying to grants and trying to look very hard for them. So that's definitely one concern. And Kayla highlighted that some youth don't have the opportunity to find that financial privilege to attend. So we're really grateful that we were able to scrounge together and make our way to Bonn. The second challenge is just having the capacity and the network to facilitate our participation. And so what I mean by that is that preparing for an international negotiation isn't something you do on a daily basis. For us youth, it's probably one of the first few times you've attended a conference of this size and this scale. And so figuring out even where to start, how do you strategize, where are the opportunities for us to intervene and to make recommendations to decision makers, that's all quite new to us. And so it was a big question hanging over our heads, like how do we get prepared for COP23, make sure that every moment we're spending there is something where we're putting forward action and making it worthwhile, making it worth all that time. So for us, finding the resources to help us participate in COP. So I guess part of that was strategizing, some mentorship from Jeffrey and excuse me, and Deb and the other people at BCCIC on how these meetings work. That was really helpful for us. I guess another resource that we would appreciate, which we saw as like an obstacle, was just having the networks as well. So knowing who's working on what, or maybe getting a referral into a decision maker or so on that might be able to help us connect, because I know that we were not able to get a meeting with Minister McKenna, for instance. She decided to only meet Minister McKenna, the Federal Minister of the Environment. She only met with the Canadian Youth Delegation, the official one, and I believe she had a more general meeting for youth generally in Canada. So maybe having the context might have helped us meet these key decision makers better. And the third challenge that we faced was just the structure of the UN negotiations. This access issue is definitely of concern for both youth and civil society. And there's kind of like 2 sub-issues here. One is that there's access. There's kind of different tiers of access at the negotiations. So at COP23, there's badges that indicate what meetings can you go to. And so for a person who works in the government of that country, so a state or a party badge, they're able to access all the negotiations and go to all the zones. However, for us, we were observers, so that's kind of the second tier. We're allowed to access those negotiations as well. But if a party requests that observers leave the room, that request is sometimes it's definitely listened to, and observers have to leave the room. And when you're discussing really pressing issues, not having the presence of civil society observers is really concerning for transparency and accountability. And finally, the third tier is not even allowed to go into negotiations. At a different zone. At Bonn, it was 15 minutes away by walking. They were not allowed into negotiation zones. So that's what most civil society people have. And definitely, again, it's just a concern about what civil society is able to see and hear at these conferences. And the other bit about accessibility to conferences is to do with the technical jargon and just all the different layers and pieces of the negotiations. Understanding that is a huge obstacle. I know that I've worked in environmental policy myself, but sometimes talking to my fellow youth delegates about another aspect, I have no idea what they're talking about. And that's definitely an obstacle to understanding what's going on. And if you're unfamiliar with it or unfamiliar with the context, it's really unclear about what, if countries are proposing is really radical and really putting forward something constructive, or if it's really just business as usual.
So like youth constituencies like Yango and also the environment constituency, Climate Action Network, they put out policy documents or just general preparation documents before COP every year. But those documents, because every year they throw around some new terms and terminologies. Like this year is the Talanoa concept. It's a Fiji traditional Pacific Island collaborative concepts about dialogue and cooperation. So every year there's these new jargons and new terms and new concepts throwing around that it's very hard for youth, especially those who are still in school, to really follow all that's happening at climate change conferences or the general climate change policy arena. And also in regards to financial supports, Yango has always been pushing member states to provide financial assistance to youth delegates going to these kind of conferences, including giving them party badges, which is the pink badge that allow them to go into more negotiations to youth. However, there's not really much progress in both of those areas. First country really feels like youth kind of goes against the state's position on climate change the majority of the time. So they are reluctant to give youth the access, the party badge, and in fear that they might talk to the press on behalf of the country because they have the country badge recognizing them as a country delegate. Yeah, anything else? So,
well, maybe what we can do now is open the floor to any questions. Any other discussion points come up, we'll just address them.
I'd also mention that anything technical or any terms that we might have mentioned, they are all quite thoroughly outlined in our project impact report, which Bernard mentioned is on the BCCIC website, and that kind of goes through everything in a lot more detail and specifics as well. Let's check that out.
I think as we were preparing for this, we're really curious if there's any other common CSO challenges that U.S. civil society often face in participating and engaging. And we will talk a bit about what some suggestions we thought. We have some recommendations for how we can encourage more youth engagement and CSO engagement. So should we jump in that first and then?
We can check if anyone.
Check in with the challenges first, or
we can check if anyone have any questions or comments so far, and we can address them.
All right, I'll read the first question then.
Yeah, sure.
So from Vera, Vera says, "I would be interested in what your recommendations were. What did you talk to Elizabeth May and others?"
So I guess we can start with the question about our meetings with Elizabeth May and other delegates to COP this week.
Yeah. We actually wrote out some stuff on it. One of the first and foremost, I mean, one of the key things that we, there we go, looked at when we went to talk with, especially Canadian government officials, was talking about fully funded delegations to COP. So as Verna mentioned before, the biggest challenge, I think, for a lot of youth is the financial accessibility. And something that we mentioned, which particularly Elizabeth was very enthusiastic about, was having mention of fully funding youth every year, which if I'm not mistaken, she mentioned that in the past, that was actually a norm prior to the Harper government. And so that's something that I guess is still being implemented in the current administration, but with significant delay, it seems. Some of the other stuff that we talked about was an overview of the Environment Commissioner's report, the government intervention in incentivizing electric cars, the kind of International Renewable Energy Association in Canada's interest in that, and some stuff around carbon taxation, specifically to international shipping and to flights, was another particular concern of ours. I mean, the other part of that was also recognizing that Elizabeth is only one MP in the House, and that there's kind of limited amounts of but I would definitely say that she was extremely supportive of everything that we wanted to mention. On top of that, some of the others were George Heyman, who George, our state minister, we talked to specifically about some policy items here in BC and what the new government was aiming at. With carbon pricing, we talked to him a lot about progressive carbon taxation, so looking at redistribution to rural communities, especially investments in transit infrastructure we felt were direly needed, and he was serious. What else did we talk about? A little bit of, also investments in green infrastructure in larger cities like Vancouver, but that it was particularly important in those rural areas, as well as First Nations consultation for the impact assessment processes. And he also expressed a desire to us to amend the existing environmental assessment starting here in 2018. So there was a lot of interest around that. Ken Alex, who I mentioned before, is the senior policy advisor to Jerry Brown, the governor of California. We had some interesting talks with him about the coordination between countries and exactly what California is doing. And he mentioned actually about California's climate summit happening in September in San Francisco. A little bit about the work of the coalition of cities and of states in the United States of America who are working on climate action independently of the federal government. And we also talked to Jennifer May, who is the Deputy Ambassador to Germany, and she was I can't remember the exact title, but she works under Stéphane Dion.
So he's an ambassador to EU.
Ambassador to EU, right, okay. And she's the deputy? So something like that, yeah. So we talked a little bit about the CETA, so the Canadian-European Comprehensive Trade Agreement, and a little bit about the environment section of that. And she also expressed support for youth involvement in these processes. And lastly was Chief Bill Erasmus, who's a regional chief with the Assembly of First Nations in Canada, specifically in the Northwest Territories, and also the national chief of the Dene Nation. Vernon and I had a great conversation with him, a little bit about his interest or his support for the Indigenous peoples and local communities knowledge platform, as well as the importance of youth engagement in the UNFCCC processes. And we had an interesting kind of discussion with him around the way that First Nation communities viewed youth, and specifically how he mentioned not about tokenizing youth, but about valuing youth for their skills and contributions on an equal level. So he kind of talked about if you have something to offer, then that's how we value, and that's how we bring you in to participate, rather than having kind of that token youth. And that was something that we thought was symbolically very important. And so we had a number of other meetings with key youth from other countries, but those were kind of the key high level officials.
Oh, I can read that out. So from BCCIC says, can you talk a bit more about engaging other youth when you got back? How much do they know about the COP process, and how did they express that they would like to make an impact themselves? Ooh, I love that.
Okay, so after we got back, we were invited to different campus clubs and the different organizations to talk about our experience at COP23. And also before we left, we also sent out a survey around campus to see how, like, what's kind of people's our fellow students' attitudes think about climate change and COP23 and climate policy and those kind of stuff. Anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, so a few of us went in and gave some guest lectures. We visited clubs, and then we also independently held our own recap event on UBC campus where all of us, it was probably the most detailed, comprehensive summary of COP23 that anybody could possibly give. We started all the way back in the Rio summit and explained, like, what is the UN climate framework? How does it work? What is the Paris Agreement and things like that, just to bring all of our fellow students up to speed, because I have the sense that many of our peers know what the Paris Agreement is and read about it, but having that real in-depth knowledge of how the negotiations actually work is very valuable for anybody wanting to participate and like influence the outcome. What else? Yeah, so we at the end of that session, we were approached by a lot of peers who were like, how can I go? Like, I want to go. Can we go with BCCIC next year? Can we go with someone else? And we basically just told them how we did it and gave details on the grants available on campus to hypothetically attend these sorts of conferences. And so there's definitely a lot of interest. Yeah, students are excited. I think they just don't hear about these sorts of opportunities until after the fact.
Yeah. Also to know that this COP and UN climate change system is such a complicated and complex thing. It's pretty cool that every one of us has like a specific focus area that we can actually delve into and talk in detail about. Like for folks in this climate finance, so if there's someone might have a question about market solutions for climate change things, he will have the detailed answer. So every one of us just be like the experts in those areas and be able to talk to the students about these specific areas. Yeah, so it's pretty cool. We're able to do that.
Just to know that was how much do they know about the COP process? Yeah. I just want to add to Kayla, like especially at that recap event that we held with our peers. I think the attendance was about 40 people, filled up the room that we were in, and people just kept streaming in. What was really interesting that I noticed was that when we had like little kind of anecdotes about what happened at the conference, you might hear about, country self-interest being a problem for international negotiations, but when we had stories about how we actually saw that in action, how we saw that get resolved, that's what really engaged youth a lot more, that personal anecdote and that personal touch, because a lot of things you could read online, you could read in the news, but having people who have gone, have seen it, and also just peers, fellow students, I think that really inspired the students to really get excited about climate change and really feel that they too can make an impact.
Yeah. Sharing anecdotes of witnessing delegates throwing microphones, things like that.
Yeah. So that story is during the ACE negotiation, Action for Climate Empowerment, about funding for the education and raising awareness on climate change. It's a small group discussion, so it's only a handful of country delegates, the major country delegates, who were in the room and discussing. And one of the negotiator from either Kenya or Uganda was actually a Youngo member, and he was lucky enough to be selected as the official country negotiator for the country. And he almost threw a microphone to the ground because he was so frustrated by everyone not cooperating. But the result is pretty good. Countries agreed to add ACE funding into the official subtax to the Paris Agreement processes. So yeah, it's definitely a win. Yes. So maybe we can delve into what other NGOs can do to encourage youth engagement and our recommendations.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely looking forward to more suggestions, because this is just like some of the ideas we had, but we know that there's probably a lot more out there as well. So these kind of blend between, again, just like the challenges between youth and CSOs, more like civil society more broadly. And I think the first way that you can help encourage youth engagement in the first place is just having the opportunities. For instance, having a youth delegation available. This opportunity allowed us to engage with climate change and actually attend the conferences. I think aside from just being able to attend, it's just maybe another way this youth delegation opportunity is really valuable is that it's a really clear, actionable item. A lot of times when we talk about, like go and promote climate change and action to address climate change, when it's not attached to a clear action item, it can kind of get vague. And for youth who, as I said before, they maybe don't have that context, don't have that broad understanding of the things at play. Having a clear actionable item is really helpful, rather than tasking them to navigate it right off bat.
Sorry, what's an example of an action item?
An action item. So I would say something like attend this event, and people will we'll be discussing about ways you can take action. And I think that some of the things we put forward was, bringing people together from those different clubs and help advising them with like how might UBC 350 move forward and connect with the climate change processes and so on. So I think those were more clear actual items rather than just learn more about the UN climate change processes. Yeah. Another way that for NGOs to encourage youth engagement or see more participation from civil society is to provide resources for that participation. I think I've talked enough about how it's hard to navigate. Yeah, and as you've heard from my fellow delegates, that we've worked alongside a lot of variety of organizations, people outside of the BCCIC, people outside of our immediate delegation, and learning alongside them has been really invaluable to our experience and helping us understand what's there still to be done. And that helps us engage better once we understand what's going on, where areas need that recommendation. So just another way that NGOs can help is to serve as a resource for youth and for other civil society as well. We've mentioned already before about how lack of understanding of what's going on or resources, guideposts to help us navigate climate change negotiations, that can be a barrier to participation. And another way to help with that resource is to really seek linkages between the work that you do and as well as the UN climate change processes. It really helps, I think, especially for youth, to explain the relevance of the UN process to them, and that's what we did in our recap event, and people finally saw some connections, and I think took that away as a message. And a message that we've set to those high-level decision makers, as Colton mentioned, is to promote the inclusion of civil society and youth in official delegations, and that's obviously another recommendation.
Yeah. And I would add just as a side note to that as well, and kind of relating to what we talked about in the past, that it was our recommendation to government bodies, both the BC provincial government and the federal government, to really seriously consider the funding of delegations, and that the resources should be mobilized by the government rather than NGOs who lack capacity as it is, and that's really in the responsibility of those. Yeah.
I noticed that we have a question from BCCIC. It says, have you thought about how you might continue to advocate for future youth delegations, especially now that you have an impact report?
So the next stage of the youth delegation is mainly to reconnect with those people who we've met in COP, including the youth delegates, the country officials, and Chief Bill Erasmus, and all those people. Try to follow up with them and try we will send them the project impact report and tell them all the impact that they've made on the delegation and how we are continue to engage our community in climate action. And another project we're doing is to connect with UBC as well as the student government AMS to try to convince them to either apply for UNFCCC accreditation in the coming years, or ask UBC to give out those accreditations to deserving students and researchers to send them to climate change conferences. Currently, UBC sends some people that
less than 5 badges.
Right. So this time they sent a professor, two people, one professor, one random person to Bonn. But we want to try to convince them to open those seats to youth and UBC students, especially in their undergraduate and graduate studies, to these international conferences, so they can actually get hands-on experience on either policy making or climate change research. Because a huge part of climate change and negotiation and conferences is the scientific side of it. There are researchers from around the world attending this conference and sharing their scientific data with policymakers and other researchers. So it's great for people who are actually in these kind of research fields to go to Bonn and talk and connect with other scientists and researchers in the field, and together seek solutions to climate change and bring about collective action.
Anything else? That's it.
Any other questions from other people?
Yeah, we can wait a minute or two, see if anybody has anything to ask.
Sure. So yeah. So how did you guys hear about this opportunity back last year in summer?
Came across, like, I don't know if it was an email or a social network or whatever it was, but somehow it came across, and I was extremely interested in the opportunity. As I mentioned before, I study economics and have a particular interest in environmental economics and the policy around that. So that was kind of my passion, was to engage with these higher level processes and understand where domestic policy intersected with international negotiations. What about you? Oh,
Yeah.
if we sent another delegation, do you have recommendations for BCCIC going forward?
Okay. Sorry, we just read the question aloud. Yeah.
We have recommendations.
We do have
We
recommendations.
have lots of recommendations, but we just need to find a document that we wrote them on. Give us a sec. While we were preparing for the selection of the youth delegation, we sent out invitation link to all the universities in BC, majority of the universities in BC, as well as specific faculty like Department of Political Science or International Relations and Environment, Geology, those kind of departments, so they can send out newsletters. Unfortunately, this time we had, it's a bit rush, so the email they sent out was not actually on time, so we lost a lot of applicants because of that. I guess this is in one of our recommendations to leave a bigger time to better prepare and leave there bigger gaps between different action items and accommodate other institutions and their protocols, trying to advertise these kind of opportunities. So recommendations?
I have one just off the top of my head is we were talking about possibly a mentorship system where because it was so useful to have Jeffrey with us in Bonn because he had previously been to intersessionals and knew both just like logistical items about being in Bonn and the conference center, but also was able to answer all of our dumb questions about how UNFCCC works and where to be at 8 a.m. in the morning for Youngo meetings and things like that. I think either all of us or a subset of us could in some way engage with the next cohort of BCCIC youth delegates to be a source of support. And I think the most useful thing about that is so that the next delegation can maximize their time in Bonn as much as possible, because most of us were only there for a week, and it goes by just like that. And the pace of the negotiations is super quick as well. So being as prepared as possible and not wasting time just trying to find your way while you're over there. Even though that's fine, everybody like needs to wander a bit when they're there. It's quite overwhelming, but I think that would be a helpful thing.
Yeah. So our project impact report, we include a few recommendations for our future youth delegations if BCCIC or other people are hoping to put together youth delegation. And so I'll first briefly go over the challenges, and hopefully that will provide a context as to why we have provided these recommendations. So firstly, one of the biggest challenges we had was about clarity about the delegate role and the delegation role at COP. And so just understanding, how does the delegation support BCCIC? How does the delegate support the delegation? And how do the delegates come up with their own goals in the first place? Another challenge is just coordination with the delegation. So we had 7 members, and as we mentioned, 2 of them do study outside of Vancouver. So figuring out how to coordinate and who does what, that's another challenge and something we've worked on. And finally, with that many delegation members and with such a diversity of interests, how do we best utilize all the skills and experiences that people bring to the table? There's definitely a lot of opportunity to do so with people of all such interests. So it really would make sense to maximize everybody's expertise. So in regards to those challenges, our suggestions going forward would be to clarify perhaps in the application process or in the first few meetings about what the delegates' roles are. At first, it wasn't really clear if the delegation supports BCCIC, but we were really excited to find out that the BCCIC was really open to the views that we had and just really wanted us to develop our own goals, to develop our passions and our interests, and to really pursue them. So we appreciate that. It wasn't so clear in the application process. So knowing that, perhaps future applicants can prepare better for their application. Another way, especially for the coordination within the delegation, BCIC could support this by starting the strategy conversation a bit earlier. For us, that took place about 1 month before the conference, and so that's not a lot of time to do the necessary research, to start emailing people to set up meetings, and so on. So starting the whole strategy conversation earlier could help facilitate just a bit more time to work on what the delegation strategy is. And for more on coordination within the delegation, as well as to maximize the experiences that people bring to the table, that's just a lot of coordination with the delegation. What really helped is that we, at first, we did not have kind of designated coordinators in our delegation, but once we did, that really started getting things moving as these coordinators kind of designated who does what, followed up on deadlines, and helped bring pieces together and people together. Another way that we could improve coordination, I think, is by having regular meetings. It's a really good kind of reminder to have something prepared for that, and to be able to discuss at meetings how do you putting pieces together from different people, and then being able to set another goal or a deliverable for the next week and so on. That could help with the coordination. And so those two that we just mentioned about the coordinators and meetings, those are more formal actions, but perhaps just to improve the overall team working relationship, like co-working meetings or other informal kind of get-togethers might also help as well. And the fourth thing about fourth kind of recommendation we have about how do you delegates understand what their relationship to the conference, how they can work toward this goal. Kayla's already kind of foreshadowed that, and it's just having a mentorship in place. And it doesn't have to be it could be just a mentorship relationship, and that probably might be one of the best ways, as it's really like a person to person rather than just dumping information, because I think we all learned that no matter how much information you get about the conference, no matter how many emails you get from the Climate Action Network Canada, there's just a lot of information, and it really, like, sometimes just informal ways of getting that information through someone sharing their experience with you, just in a chat sometimes here and there. Sometimes that's the best way to get information and to understand better what goes on at the negotiations. Anything else?
So I think that's it. Yeah, cool. Any other questions that you might have? We have around a little over 3 minutes to finish this. Sure. Okay, cool. So the majority of stuff that we said in the BCCIC asked, was it fun? It was it was really fun. Yeah,
It was life changing, is what I always tell. Yeah.
Life changing.
In all honesty, I think the work that I did in the 1 week that I was in Bonn, I really felt like I was contributing to something bigger than myself. Even though it was very, a very, very small contribution, but that's just how international diplomacy works, and I think every little bit counts.
Great. All right. So the majority of stuff that we said just now in the webinar can be found in our project impact report, except for that soaring microphone story. Other than that, everything is in there, and we strongly encourage you to check it out on bccic.ca.
Read it, share it.
Yeah, read it and share it. And we're looking forward to you. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact us. Our contact information is on the website as well, and in the project impact reports. So yeah,
I think, and I would just finally add as well that I think we're all happy to talk to anyone who ever wants to reach out to us about this experience or about climate action as well.
Or any questions specifically just about what happened at this last
Yeah,
talk.
absolutely.
Yeah.
If your organization needs modality on youth engagement and youth selection procedures, we are also able to help you to do that, because we have a pretty set up procedure and protocols and the modalities for that. So if you're interested, just contact us and we will provide every support that we can. So thank you so much for joining this webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.